the Deseret Book Audio Library presents When We Meet Again, Volume 4 in the series Children of the Promise by Dean Hughes. Abridgment read by Tom Hughes. And now, When We Meet Again.
When We Meet Again by Dean Hughes. Chapter 1. Snow had fallen again. It lay glistening over the field of battle. To Alex Thomas it seemed that nature had chosen to purify this patch of Belgium, to hide the bomb craters and desiccated villages. But the elegance of the snow-covered fields, the fences and barns, couldn't change the truth. Frozen bodies, both American and German, lay under all that beauty. Of course, every soldier at times felt a certain envy. At least the dead had been delivered from the torturous cold. The clouds had cleared now, and the night temperatures were fierce. Alex had told the men in his squad to dig in deep, but they had marched in heavy snow all day, taken a pounding from mortars and artillery, and the effort to hack away at the frozen earth had been more than they could summon. They had only penetrated the ground far enough to get out of the wind, and now they lay huddled against one another in pairs. They were wrapped in blankets, but they were mostly defenseless against the brittle air, and the sweat they had worked up while digging had turned to ice in their clothes. Alex and his partner, Private Myron Davis, had not dug much deeper than the others. Out of exhaustion they had fallen asleep, but not for long. Alex had awakened trembling and suddenly frightened by what he felt from Davis next to him. Davis was a strongly built young man, not yet 20, but there was no fat on him, and the cold seemed to reach him more than the other men. He was shaking so badly that Alex thought he was convulsing. Alex reached around Davis, pulled the blanket tighter against his wool coat. "Are you all right?" he asked. "No, I'm not. How could I be all right?" Alex, of course, wasn't surprised by the bitterness in Davis's voice. The troops of the 101st Airborne Division had spent a month out in this cold almost constantly. They had been transported to Bastogne without winter clothes or adequate supplies, and they had been greatly outnumbered by the German Wehrmacht and SS troops. Surrounded and cut off from supplies, they had held their ground, held Bastogne, and now, with other Allied forces, had stopped the bulge that the Germans had created in the defense line. The Americans had been battered by heavy artillery, and more than half their men had been killed or seriously wounded, but they had refused to retreat, and now they were pushing back. In the town of Foy, Alex and his men had had a chance to get inside for a few nights, and there mail had caught up with them. Alex had learned from Anna, his wife, that he was going to be a father. It was January 1945, and the baby was due in June. Sitting by a fire with friends around him, he had felt the power of this news, and he had cried. But now, back out in the cold, back in the battle, a numbness had returned, filling his head and chest, seeming to rob him of the things he wanted to feel. Alex knew he wouldn't sleep the rest of the night, but sleep was a luxury, not something he ever counted on. He longed for the escape it would provide, but mostly, he just wanted to get this night over, get up and go so his heart would pump some heat into his body. The night before, Lieutenant Owen, 2nd platoon leader, had talked to the squad leaders. He had told Alex and the others that the company would attack Noville at first light. "It's supposed to be about 800 meters into town. We'll probably catch hell all the way there. The Germans have some tanks and they know we're coming. We need to get down that open road just as fast as we can. Once we get to the houses, we'll have some cover, but up until then, it could be bad." Alex kept his arm around Davis and neither spoke again, but the hours ticked away one slow second at a time. When Lieutenant Owen finally began to move about and tell the men it was time to get up, Alex felt only relief. After the men had eaten a little breakfast from K-ration cans, Corporal Duncan walked over to Alex. "I don't like this one," he said. 800 meters is a long old haul." He cursed softly. But then he put his hand on Alex's shoulder and said, "Good luck, Deacon." "You too," Alex said. Something like a prayer passed through Alex's mind, but he didn't try to formulate the words. He had become too fatalistic. God's will was coming, one way or the other, it seemed to him. He and Duncan had been through so many of these attacks together. It was hard not to believe that their luck would run out one of these times. Dawn was nothing more than a gray hint off to the right of the soldiers when the command came down, whispered along the line, "Move out." 2nd Platoon, Alex's unit, was heading straight down the road, with 3rd Platoon on the right, east of the road. Alex watched as the first squad led out, and then he waved for his own men to follow him in a file. They went hard and had cut the distance almost in half when the first explosion sounded. It seemed to be mortar fire, muffled by the snow, and targeted at 3rd Platoon off to the right. "Go hard, don't stop, get to the houses," Alex shouted to his squad. The men picked up the pace, running now, tromping down the snow-packed road, their gear clattering. A few more seconds passed, and all the fire was still to the right, but then a searing light flashed in Alex's eyes, and he went down. The concussion slammed against his steel helmet as he fell. He felt the breath suck from him, his ears crackle. He didn't know whether he had been hit or not. He expected pain, something specific, and yet he was already struggling to his feet. "Keep going, men, keep going," he screamed. But he couldn't see anything straight in front of him, his eyes still blinded from the flash. In his peripheral vision he could see where the road was, so he pushed forward, but another explosion sounded to his left. It bowled him over, and this time a sharp pain, biting hot, was in his shoulder, seeming to burrow on through. He grabbed at the pain and rolled on his side, but he knew instinctively that he wasn't hurt bad, and once again he worked to get his feet under him. This time, though, he heard coughing, choking, next to him on the ground. Alex grabbed for the man next to him, tried to see him. His vision was beginning to clear, and when another explosion lit the sky, he saw that it was Duncan, and that he had blood on the side of his face and on his throat. "Dunk," he yelled, "hang on!" And then he screamed, "Medic! Get up here now!" Duncan was still choking and sputtering, and Alex didn't know what to do. "You're all right, Dunk. You'll be okay." He jumped up. "Medic! Come help this man!" Someone was running toward him in the dark. "Help this man. He's hit in the throat." Alex had to go. He couldn't stop to deal with this, not even for Duncan. Let's go, he shouted, and he no longer knew who was where. He charged toward a house on the edge of town, flattened himself against the outside wall, waited a few seconds, and then looked around the corner. About then, Irv Johnston came running up. "Let's go," Alex called. "We've got to clear these houses." Alex ran down the street, but when he tried to hold his rifle in front of him, the pain in his left shoulder was much worse than it had been before. He kept running all the same, saw that a number of men were taking the first house on the left, and crossed to the one on the right. Johnston, who was at his side, already had a grenade ready. "Look out, Sarge," he yelled, and then he pulled the pin and rolled the grenade against the front door. Alex and Johnston threw their backs against the wall of the house on either side of the door. The crash sounded and debris flew. Alex waited a couple of seconds and then spun toward the door. Johnston burst inside ahead of him. Alex followed, but all was silent and dark inside. Then from up the stairs someone shouted, "Please no shoot." The accent was French, not German, and it was a woman. Johnston ran to the foot of the stairs and pointed his rifle up the staircase. "Come down, hands up." A light came on upstairs, and then, in a moment, 2 bare feet appeared on the steps. A woman in a nightdress came out of the dark. "No shoot," she said again, and she walked carefully down the stairs. She was a woman in her 50s, perhaps, a thin woman with graying hair tied up in a bun. "Are there Germans here?" Johnston shouted at her. "No," she said. "They go." Just then Alex heard a click, and his eyes darted to the stairway. He could see the toe of a black boot sticking out from around the wall at the head of the stairs. "We'll be going," he said. He turned his back, took a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, counted 1, 2, then suddenly spun and threw it up the stairs. The grenade blew, sending plaster and wood flying, and a body thudded to the floor. In an instant, Alex was up the stairs, his rifle ready. The man who had been hiding was on the floor in a heap. Another officer was on his knees, holding his hands to his face. "Take your pistol out. Drop it on the floor," Alex shouted. Noville fell easily once the half-mile charge had been completed, but a lot of men had been hit coming down the road. As soon as Alex could find someone to hold his prisoner, he looked for his men, got them established in a house, and then he walked up the road to a temporary aid station, back where he and Davis had dug in the night before. He was weak now from the pain and the loss of blood, and he needed to get his shoulder bandaged, but he also needed to know about Duncan, and he feared the worst. He found Duncan in a tent, bandaged and drugged with morphine. His eyes were closed, but he opened them when Alex spoke to him. "Dunk, how are you doing?" Duncan's head moved just a little, a sort of nod. There were 3 other men on cots in the tent. One of them said, "He can't talk. Shrapnel tore up his throat." Duncan took a long, raspy breath and then seemed to choke. "Don't try to talk, Dunk. Just take it easy. You'll be fine. They'll probably fly you over to England. You'll be drinking beer in some London pub in a few days." But Alex didn't know what to think. Duncan didn't look good. He was white, almost blue, and who knew what might be ripped up in his neck? Alex didn't know what else to say. He could hardly face the idea of going on through this war without Duncan next to him. He wanted to tell the man that, wanted to tell him a lot of things, but he didn't think he could get the words out. not without making a fool of himself. So he knelt next to Duncan's cot, and he put his arms around him, gave him as much of a hug as he could. "I'm going to miss you, man," he said. He stood, and he felt himself, almost an act of his muscles, try to pull himself together. He left the tent, and then he went looking for someone to fix his shoulder, but he felt overwhelmingly alone. He and Duncan had always made it together. What was he supposed to do now? E Company spent only one day in Noville, one warm night, and then the battalion made a last push toward another little village. The town fell without too many casualties, and on January 17, the division was finally replaced. The 17th Airborne moved in, and the entire 101st boarded trucks. The word was they were going to be transported to France. When the men climbed into the trucks, only 6 men were left in Alex's squad. Gurley and Duncan had gone down in this last push, and now Alex and Curtis were the only 2 left from the original squad. Chapter 2. Wally Thomas had drifted for a time, had actually been close to sleep. The pain had not exactly abated, but if he stayed completely still, he could avoid the excruciating stabs that any movement caused. But now something had brushed against his face and brought him back to consciousness. He didn't want to turn his head, couldn't really. He remembered the bread that the guard had set next to him on the floor by his mat, the bread he hadn't been able to eat. And then he knew, recognized the little scratching noises. A rat was eating the bread, just inches from his cheek. He thought of reaching, of knocking it away, but he couldn't move that forcefully. The pain would be more than he could stand, and he couldn't bring himself to care that much. When the rat scurried over him, across his chest, and then a few minutes later returned across his face, the little feet stabbing at his cheeks, touching his lips, the thought of it was disgusting, even frightening, but such emotions didn't register clearly now. Wally had lost track of time, but he thought he had been in the barracks for 3 days. He was in the building set aside for sick POWs. When a man simply could not make it to the mine, and the guards could see it, he was sent to this place, often to die. An Australian doctor tried to do what he could for the patients, but he had no medicine. Wally had a fever of some kind, maybe rheumatic fever, the doc said, but there wasn't much to do but hold on and hope for the best. Chuck Adair, the closest of Wally's friends, was already in the same barracks. He had vomited until he was dehydrated and had been brought here a week before Wally, almost dead. It was 2 days before Wally's fever broke, but when it did, water poured from him, and that night Wally slept, actually moved into that inviting emptiness he had been longing for since the fever first struck him. When he awoke, well into the following day, he was beginning to feel some sense of himself again, some returned reality that made him care about his needs. He ate a little rice and his ration of bread. A week passed, but that was too long for the Japanese guards. Men could take their time dying if they needed to, but taking time to get well was unacceptable. So Wally and Chuck were put on limited duty, which meant that they could be included in work details around the camp. Their first assignment, with some other men who were also recovering from illnesses, was to shovel dirt over a newly built concrete air raid shelter. The prisoners on the detail were given picks and short-handled shovels and placed under the supervision of an American sergeant. By afternoon, the men were hardly moving, all of them so depleted they could barely manage to stay on their feet. Chuck and Wally knew better than to sit down, but they were both leaning on their shovels, looking toward the ground, when they suddenly heard a loud voice. "Attention!" Chuck and Wally brought themselves straight. Wally wondered what had happened. Why hadn't the sergeant warned them? He and Chuck were in big trouble. But it was worse than Wally had imagined. The man who stood before them, still at a distance, was the Japanese camp commander. Hisitaki was his name. He was a short man who strutted about in his fancy officer's uniform with a two-fisted sword strapped to his side. "None know," the commander demanded. Wally knew the meaning of this. "What are you doing?" And so he tried to explain. With motions, and mostly with English words, he tried to say that he and Chuck had been sick and that they were near collapse now. It was not hard to see that the little commander wasn't satisfied. He stared at Wally, his eyes intense and hateful, then at Chuck. Then he came forward, reached out, and grabbed the shovel away from Wally, and without warning, swung it at Wally's head. Wally ducked away automatically. He escaped the edge of the blade that would have slashed his face, but the flat side of the shovel struck him across his head and sent a flash of pain through his skull. Wally went down, but he tried to get back up. As he did, he caught the back of the shovel over the top of his head. He dropped on his face, and now Commander Hisataki used this chance to slam him again and again, hitting him on the shoulders and back. Wally felt pain everywhere, but worst in the small of his back. He wondered whether his spine might be broken. But the commander was telling him to get up, so Wally struggled to his feet. He stood as straight as he could, trembling, panting. "Come with me," Hisataki said in English, and he walked toward the guardhouse. There he called 2 guards outside. The 3 Japanese men talked, and Wally couldn't follow what they were saying, but one of the guards finally walked away, and when he returned he was carrying 2 rough bamboo poles. The guards placed the poles on the ground, parallel to each other, about a foot apart. "Get down," one of the guards commanded, and now Wally got the picture. He and Chuck were forced to kneel on one of the poles, with the other one under their shins. Then the guards stood on Chuck and Wally's feet to press their bones down hard onto the poles. Sweat broke out on Wally's face immediately. The pain was intense on his knees and shins, and it was already shooting up his legs. After a minute or two, the guards stepped away, but there was no escaping the full weight of their own bodies, pressing their legs against the rough, hard bamboo. As each minute passed, the pain only increased, and Wally knew the guards would push this torture to some limit of pain, and then beyond. And with that realization came the crucial question: how long could he hold out? At the moment, the answer seemed to be that he could last another 30 seconds, maybe another minute. But when a minute passed, he told himself that he could go 1 more minute. Then, if he couldn't stand it, he would simply lie down and they could kill him. But he wasn't ready to give up quite yet. 5 minutes passed that way, and then 10. Or maybe it wasn't nearly that long. Wally had already lost his sense of time. All he knew was that he couldn't last much longer. Hisataki finally spoke again, from behind Chuck and Wally, who were next to each other, shoulder to shoulder. Wally understood enough to know that the commander was leaving, and he was turning the punishment over to the guards. Wally also knew, just as he had sensed from the beginning, that this torture was not going to be a matter of a few minutes. The commander began to walk away and then suddenly turned back. He came around in front of the man. Wally expected a blow from the shovel still in Hisataki's hands, almost welcomed it as a chance to fall to the ground again and end the pain in his legs. But the commander handed the shovel to Wally, made him hold the handle with both hands. Then he motioned for Wally to raise it above his head. Wally did as he was told, and then Hisataki nodded. "You hold it. No put down." Wally was on the edge of breaking down. He could see in the guard's face that the man had no intention of stopping the torment any time soon. But just then Chuck whispered, "I can't do this much longer." "Yes, you can," Wally told him. And of course, he was telling himself the same thing. "We'll get numb. It won't hurt so much." But an hour went by, or some time that seemed like an hour, and the guard showed no sign of change. He didn't check the time, didn't seem to have any plan to stop what was happening. Wally realized the truth. There was no end to this, and he shouldn't think about it that way. It was like the imprisonment itself. A prisoner had to take it a day at a time and not think about the future. The pain was something to keep on the surface, accept as the current condition without considering when it might stop. It was that understanding that got him through the afternoon. Time kept passing, hours, not minutes, and Wally was barely sentient. Reality had turned into a dreamy sort of blur outside himself. As evening came on, Wally realized that this might be a death penalty. He could feel his body breaking down, his strength giving out. He and Chuck had been too worn down going into this. There was no way they could hold any position for much longer, with or without the pain. And then Wally heard an odd whistling sound. His body jerked, reacted to a flash of light and what he thought was a clap of thunder. But the flashes continued in a steady rhythm, the rumbling sounds, and by then Wally knew. Bombs were falling. One crashed very close, hit a building in the compound, and others were falling in the city and off toward the mine. "Americans," Chuck said. Yes, it had to be. Bombers were striking Omuda. Wally had heard rumors that Japan was being bombed now, but he had never heard or seen any direct evidence of it. But this was it. Maybe there was an invasion going on. Maybe the war was nearing its end. Wally's reactions were confused. He could be struck by an American bomb at any moment. But he felt no fear. What he believed was that God had sent these bombers now, for him and Chuck, that the two of them were being freed. "Don't move yet," Wally told Chuck. "Wait." Wally wanted the guards to release him. He wondered how angry they might be with bombs dropping. He didn't want to give them any excuses to take out their anger on him and Chuck. For a time there was confusion. The man who had been guarding Wally and Chuck left for a couple of minutes, or at least moved out of their line of sight. But then he returned and he shouted, "Stand up!" Wally felt the release, the relief, but he couldn't get up. He put a hand down and lowered himself onto his side. He tried to straighten his legs just a little, but pain shot through his body. He lay still, panting. Chuck was next to him, grunting, crying out at times. Suddenly someone grabbed Wally under the arms, dragged him on his side up some steps and into the guardhouse. Then the man dropped Wally on a concrete floor in a dark little room. In another minute or so, Chuck arrived the same way. Without saying a word, the guard stepped out, shut the door, and locked it. Wally was still curled up, still in agony, but he also knew the worst was over, at least for now. He looked up at the barred window in the room, and he saw lights flashing, the distant report of continued explosions. And then he shut his eyes and said, "Thank you, Heavenly Father. Thank you." Chuck was muttering the same words. Chapter 3. Bobby Thomas looked out at the ocean. She loved to watch the emerald waves rise, swell, then break and turn white as they crashed toward the beach. She was sitting next to Richard Hammond, just as she had the year before when he had been getting ready to go to sea. He was back now, and they were officially engaged, but they were about to be separated again. In another week, the first week of February 1945, he would be transferred to the mainland. He would be going to San Francisco first, where a specialist, a doctor who did hand surgery, would operate to remove scar tissue and try to salvage more of the movement in his left hand. After that, he would be reporting to the Bushnell Military Hospital in Brigham City, Utah, only about 100 miles from his home in Springville. "I wish I were going with you," Bobby said. Words she had spoken a dozen times before, but words she was feeling more powerfully every day. Richard was going home, and now she was the one going to sea. She had received an assignment as the head of a burn ward on a hospital ship, the Charity. The next time it put in at Pearl Harbor, and that was likely to happen within the next 2 or 3 weeks, she would make the transfer. "Richard," Bobby said, "why don't we get married now, before you leave next week?" "I'll tell you what I love most about you, Bobby. You're so subtle." "You should be flattered." She put her hand on his cheek, turned his face, and kissed him. "It means I want you." "You brazen woman." "I know, I am." She put her hand on his chest and shoved him, drove him onto his back, and then she leaned over him and kissed him seriously. Or at least tried to. Both were laughing by then. Richard rolled onto his side, slipped his bandaged hands around Bobby, and took her in his arms. He lay still for a long time before he said, "I don't know how to do that, Bobby. Get married and then leave a few days later. But we'd have things to remember, Richard, and things to look forward to. It would bring us together." Richard didn't respond. One thing Bobby knew for sure was that she wasn't going to force this on him. Richard was not domineering, but he was also not someone who could be easily cajoled into a new way of thinking. He considered everything, came to decisions after a process, not an impulse. And the truth was, she wasn't sure it was wise to get married now either. As much as anything, she wanted to be reassured that he did want her as much as she wanted him. "Bobby, I have things I have to do. Maybe it sounds strange to you, but I don't want to marry you until I have hands, until these bandages are off and I can feel somewhat normal again." "Richard, those bandages aren't important to me." He didn't say anything, but she felt a reaction, the slightest hesitation in his breathing. Bobby raised herself on one elbow and looked down at him. "Are you worried about the way your hands are going to look?" "Sure, to some degree, but that's not the main problem. I still don't know what I'll be able to do and not do. I need to find out what my limitations are." "Do you think that would matter to me?" "I don't know. I hope not." "Then what are you worried about?" "I didn't say I was worried." But now a tightness was in his voice, and Bobby really didn't understand. "Tell me what you're thinking. Are you afraid you can't make a living, or what?" "I'm not afraid. That's not the point. I'll be fine. I just need some time to get back to normal, to feel like myself again." "I don't know what that means, Richard. To me, it doesn't seem that your injuries are all that serious. I see boys in the hospital who are going home without eyes, with their arms and legs missing or their faces burned beyond recognition. You have no reason to feel abnormal." Richard sat up, and now Bobby could see that she had said the wrong thing. His jaw muscle had tightened into a little lump. "I don't feel sorry for myself, if that's what you mean," he said. "I'll manage just fine." "Richard, what are you talking about? I wasn't accusing you of anything. I just don't understand why you don't feel like yourself. I know you can't come back from all you've been through and just suddenly adjust to everything. You've been in battle, your ship was sunk, you were hurt, and—" "Bobby, I need to tell you something right now. You keep telling me you want to be open about everything, but I'm not going to talk about the war. I don't want to think about it anymore, and I certainly don't want to spend the rest of my life discussing it." "All right, I can understand that. Maybe everyone does have to hold certain things inside. We have the right to some part of us that we don't share with anyone. But that's not what I'm saying. I'm telling you I don't want certain things to be part of me, and talking about them will only make them worse, not better. Or will they fester inside you? No, I'm not going to let that happen." "Okay," Bobby said, but she wasn't convinced. There was still too much emotion in Richard's voice, too much he was holding back. And for the first time in a long time, she wondered about the two of them. What if he was too private for her? What if she did have trouble all her life dealing with his reticence? What if she questioned him too much and he gradually withdrew from her? She had seen marriages that seemed all wrong, as though two people lived in the same house, shared meals and even beds, but apparently little else. "I think maybe I ought to head back to the hospital," Richard said. "No, Richard, I won't plague you about this anymore. Let's just relax. We need to laugh." He nodded, and he even smiled, although that too seemed a little forced. "That's true," he said. He hesitated for a moment, and then added, "I think you're getting the wrong impression, Bobby. I'm fine. I really am. There's nothing bothering me that I can't deal with." "Okay." But it was the lie she heard so often at the hospital. Many of the men seemed to feel it was a sign of weakness to admit they were dealing with emotional difficulties. She watched men who were so full of pain they looked ready to explode, but who would never admit to the slightest problem. Could she really stand it if Richard would hold her outside himself that way? But she had to back off, and she knew it. So she and Richard got up, and they waded in the water, walked the beach, talked and joked. The only problem was, none of it seemed quite real, and the pretense kept hurting more and more. Finally, earlier than Bobby had planned, they began their drive back to Pearl Harbor. Along the way, Bobby told Richard, "Let's not think quite so much, okay? Let's just stay happy. What I need to remember is that a couple of months ago, I thought you were dead, and I didn't know how I was going to make it through the rest of my life. How can I feel bad just because we've got some challenges ahead? At least I know I have you, even if we're going to be away from each other for a while again. I thought I was going to die, Bobby. I could have very easily. And I kept telling myself, I've got to make it. I can't let Bobby down." "Really? You never told me that before." He nodded, and then he touched her neck with his wrist, and a little chill ran through her. "We got back to each other, Richard," she said, "and now we'll make the best of it. We're going to be all right." Richard nodded. Then he took her in his arms and held her, and he didn't seem to worry whether anyone was looking. Finally, rather late that night, they drove back to the Navy base, and Bobby redressed Richard's hands. It was actually the first time he had let her look at them. "They're not bad at all," she told him. "I've seen so much worse." He held his hands out and looked at them. "When the explosion went off, I covered my face with my hands. It was just a reaction. But that's why the back of my hands got burned. The doctor said that's a lot better than getting them burned on the palms. You protected your face, too, and your eyes. Not completely. I had some bad burns across my forehead, but they healed pretty well. I know, I can still see the scars right along here." She touched his forehead, and then she lifted each hand and kissed it. As she did, she felt his response. He didn't say so, but she knew he was relieved that she had accepted that much of him. Bobby was glad their time together was not quite at an end. She wanted to build on the feelings they had expressed later in the day and not see him leave with all the tension they had felt at Sunset Beach. When she got in bed that night, she lay on her side and hugged her pillow, as though Richard were with her there, and she reminded herself again that she had prayed for him to come back, and his return had been the greatest gift of her life. But behind the thought lay a certain uneasiness. Could she have prayed so hard, been so thankful, and all along been wrong? What if the two of them really were too different? She tried to dismiss the thoughts, tell herself that she was just being her usual, overly analytic self, but she didn't rest well. Couldn't seem to relax all night. Chapter 4. LaRue Thomas was on a date with Reed Porter. Everyone at East High now considered her Reed's girlfriend, even though the two had only been going out for a few weeks. Reed was the golden boy of the high school, the star of every sport, and a heartthrob, too, with his wavy blonde hair and childishly shy smile. He and LaRue were with two of his basketball teammates and their dates, and they had all just come from the Center Theater where they had seen National Velvet with Mickey Rooney and Elizabeth Taylor. Now they had driven to Fred and Kelly's, a malt and hamburger place on 11th South and State in Salt Lake. When the jukebox began to play Joe Stafford's What You Know, Joe, LaRue suddenly jumped up. "Come on, Reed, let's dance to this," she said. "Wait a sec, I don't want my burger to get cold." "Oh, come on, it'll be all right." She jerked on his arm, almost dragged him out of the booth they had been sitting in. She knew the truth, that he wasn't confident about his dancing. Nor should he be. The guy had no sense of rhythm at all. But LaRue didn't care. She was good, and she liked to dance where others could watch her. She was wearing a great outfit tonight, and she knew she looked cute. "Just step when I do," she said. "I'll show you the beat." He grinned. "Are you trying to tell me that I can't dance?" he said. "I wouldn't say anything like that." She winked at him. "I just like to lead. You need to get used to that." "I think I found that out already." LaRue began to jitterbug, stepping emphatically at first, showing him the rhythm. After a few repetitions, she spun under his arm, then out, and then, as she had sometimes done with her friend Ned at the USO, she spun under Reed's arm again, but this time wrapped all the way around his back, made a full turn, switched hands, and spun back out on the other side of him. When the music ended, Reed said, "Hey, let's dance to this slow one." "What about your hamburger? I thought it was getting cold." "It is cold now. What the heck?" He reached around her and tried to pull her close. "Oops, I think my malt is melting." LaRue pulled away and headed back to the table. Reed's buddies, Rex Davis and Clint Chambers, were sitting next to their dates in a booth. Reed and LaRue sat across from each other at the outside end. LaRue was the youngest person there, the only sophomore, but that didn't bother her. What did concern her was that the other two couples had apparently begun to talk about the war while she and Reed had been dancing. "The Germans are going to be finished off before long," Rex was saying. "We'll never get in on the war in Europe. But I'd rather kill Japs anyway." "I just might go with you," Reed said. LaRue saw the solemn, almost tragic look appear in his face. "Really, Reed?" Connie said. "Aren't you going to stay around for your senior year?" "I don't see how I can," Reed said. He leaned forward, placed his elbows on the table, and cast his eyes down. "It just doesn't seem right to be having a good time while so many boys are out there fighting and dying for our country. I'm afraid the war will end and I'll never get a chance to do my part." "But East High needs you," Evelyn said. "We won't win at anything if you're not here." Reed looked up again, at LaRue, not at Evelyn. "I've thought about that," he said. "I've tried to consider all the people I'll let down, no matter what I do. But I just feel like it's my country that needs me the most." "I guess the war will end a lot sooner if you're there," LaRue said. It took Reed a few seconds to realize that she was making fun of him, but he took it well. He smiled and cocked his head a little to the side as he looked at her. "Let's just say that with me and Clint and Rex there, we ought to be able to end things a year or two ahead of schedule." Clint didn't laugh the way the others did. He waited for a few seconds, and then he said, "Rex and I had to decide what to do last year, but we wanted to finish high school. If I were you, I'd do the same thing, Reed. Your senior year of sports is something you'll never forget." LaRue burst out laughing before she realized that no one else saw any humor in Clint's comment. She looked around, still smiling, and then finally said, "I'm sorry, I just thought you were going to say something about graduating." But no one seemed to see her point, so she let it go. She danced some more, and after, when Reed dropped the others off before taking her home, she knew that she could expect the final scene of the play. On her porch, Reed moved in close and put his arms around her. "LaRue, you're very special to me," he said. "If I do decide to go into the service this next year, I'll miss you most of all." She wanted to say, "Reed, I see through all this. I spent too many nights at the USO. I know all the lines." But the truth was she suddenly felt sorry for Reed. He was trying so hard. On an impulse, she decided to let him have his little victory. She looked up, turned her head so he had the correct angle, and let him kiss her. The lips were a little too tight, too hard. He wasn't very good at this kissing thing. Still, he seemed pleased with himself when he stepped back, looked her quickly in the eyes, and couldn't stop himself from smiling. But after, when LaRue went inside, she was mad at herself. Why had she allowed a kiss when she didn't really care that much for Reed? She had only done it to string him along, and she knew it. What did that make her? But she didn't like the question, didn't want to think about it, so she walked upstairs and went to bed. On Monday, LaRue saw Reed at school. By then, she wasn't posing hard questions to herself. She teased him, touched his shoulder, leaned close, and whispered in his ear. And all those little techniques worked enormously well. His face got red, and he could hardly think what he was saying. If she had said, "Now, dear Reed, tie yourself in a knot for me," he would certainly have gone to work on the project. But he had to get to basketball practice, and she was on her way out the front doors onto 13th East. It was warm outside for February, and she was glad to get out into the air. She was walking rather leisurely when someone overtook her. "Hi, LaRue," a deep voice said. She glanced to see Cecil Broadbent step alongside her. He was a boy from her ward, a year older than she was, like Reed. She had known him all her life, and she sort of liked him, even though he was her opposite in most ways. He was something of an egghead, and a loner. He didn't go to the high school games or dances, didn't even join the science clubs. In Sunday school, he would say nothing at all most of the time, but then, without any warning, ask a question that would not only baffle but sometimes anger the teacher. "Hi, Cecil," LaRue said. He was a tall boy, and his long legs were about to carry him on by, but LaRue, for reasons she didn't really understand, said, "What's your big hurry?" "I'm not hurrying," he said. "I'm just walking." But he did slow down. "I guess you have to get right home so you can dive into a book." Cecil smiled. He wasn't a bad-looking boy, actually. He had some mild problems with acne, and his eyebrows were a little too weighty and black, but he had straight white teeth and a wide smile that appeared suddenly whenever it did appear. "It's not fair to judge a fellow by his reputation," he said. But then he added, "I'll tell you the sad part. I have 2 books I'm reading right now, and I was just asking myself which one I wanted to dig into tonight after I do my homework." "What kinds of things do you read?" "Oh, everything. Russian novels are my favorite, but I like history too, and in my heart of hearts I'm a scientist." "Is that what you want to be?" "Yeah, I do. I'll probably end up in chemistry or physics, something like that, when I go to college." "What about the war?" "What about it?" "Won't it keep you from going to college for a while?" Cecil let out a puff of air, and the steam blew away in the breeze. "I keep hoping the Army will reject me for some reason. I wish I weren't so disgustingly healthy." "Don't you want to be in the service?" "Let's see, this is a hard one. Do I want someone to shoot at me, throw grenades at me, drop bombs on me, or all of the above? I think I can live without those things, thank you very much." "Hey, most of the guys your age can't wait to get out there. That's what they tell me, anyway." Cecil laughed. "I can tell you believe every word of it, too." "Cecil, how dumb do boys think girls are? They all want us to tell them what big, strong heroes they are. I'm sick of hearing it." Cecil nodded, but now he was smiling, not laughing. "LaRue, I'll never figure you out," he said. "You've always known what's really going on, but you go along with everything anyway. I remember in elementary school that club that Beth Ellison and Verlin Burney started. You made fun of the whole thing, and then you joined. And got myself elected president, too." He laughed hard, and for a time looked away as though he were trying to think back to that time. "But why do you do that?" he asked. "If I play a game, I play to win. So is that what everything is to you, a game?" "What is it to you?" "I see the games, I just don't play." "You're way too serious, Cecil. The games are what make life fun." "No, I don't buy that. I don't think you do either. The thing about you, LaRue, is that you're smart, but you don't want anyone to know it. It's like you've decided that being so beautiful you'd rather use your big brown eyes than your head to get what you want." "Beautiful? Cecil, do you think I'm beautiful?" She was smiling, flirting. "Don't do that, LaRue. You know how pretty you are. You'd be better off if you didn't know." LaRue knew she was being complimented, and at the same time cut to the bone. Who was Cecil, of all people, to be telling her how to operate in this world? But he seemed to know her secret. the one that was so obvious that she was always surprised more people didn't pick up on it. She was almost never sincere, almost always calculating. But then Cecil didn't have to be brilliant to see it. Everyone else just had to be stupid. Sounds like you don't like me, Cecil. Don't do that either. Don't do what? Don't try to get me to say what you want to hear. LaRue took a long breath and then didn't deny his accusation. She even liked the fact that he couldn't be manipulated that way. Chapter 5. Anna Thomas was at the London office of the British Secret Intelligence Service when her supervisor asked her, "Would you like to take on some additional work?" "Yes, I would," she told him. "I could use the money." "Well, it's a bit different, this. The American boys over at OSS need a good translator, and they asked us for a recommendation. I told them about you, and they want to have a chat with you just to see how it might go." So Anna walked to the American OSS office just up Grosvenor Street, and she sat down with a man who told her it was better that she not know his name for the present. He was an impressive man, however. He seemed educated, well-spoken. He interviewed Anna carefully, learning everything he could about her background in Germany and about her American husband, and yet Anna had the feeling that he already knew everything she told him. Eventually the man said, "Mrs. Thomas, I'm willing to hire you based on what we've talked about, but you must understand that you'll be required to come here, never to take your work home as you have done for the M6 fellows at SIS, and you won't be able to speak a word about what you learn, not to your mother, not to anyone. This is top-secret material, and we don't like to put it in the hands of civilians. But it's information coming out of Germany, and our own people simply don't have the background they need. You know the country, the nuances of language, landmarks, culture, all in a way that our people never will." "I understand." He folded his arms across his chest. He was wearing a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows and a dreary tie, dark blue, that was loose at the neck. Anna thought that before the war he might have been a professor, certainly not a military man. There was something contemplative and distant about him, even as engaged as they were in conversation. "But let me explain a little about these transmissions," he added, "and you'll understand why no word of this material can ever leave the building." Anna nodded. "The British have never done much to penetrate Germany. We have far too little reconnaissance information about the effects of our bombing, about troop movements, fortifications, and build-ups, civilian morale, all kinds of things. For the last few months we've been getting our own people into the country. Most of them are native German speakers, and some don't speak much English, so many of the transmissions are in German." "Will I translate the radio messages?" "Yes. The messages are recorded on a spool of wire. You can play them back on a machine I'll show you how to operate. Sometimes the signals break up a little, but most of the recordings are pretty clear. Let me have you listen to one. Come with me." The agent got up from his desk and motioned toward the door, but in the hallway he walked ahead. Anna had had time to get very nervous by then. She wondered whether her English would be adequate to give him what he wanted. The man led her to a little room only large enough for a desk and chair. He held the door for her and then closed it behind him. On the desk was a little recording machine. The man showed her how to load the spool of wire and how to play and rewind it. "This is a new recording," he told her. "Listen and see whether you can understand it all right." What she felt as she listened was something she hadn't experienced lately. She heard the hurried descriptions of bombing raids, of reconstruction efforts, of troop movements, even of resistance work. But beyond the words, she heard the speaker's anxiety, the same trepidation she had lived with for such a long time when the war was lurking nearby. In Berlin, she had known the horror of the blanket bombing raids, and in London the threat of rockets. But for Londoners now, the threat of attack was mostly over, and it was easy to lose touch with that terror of present danger. She thought of her father moving about in Germany, perhaps, relaying transmissions, putting his life in constant danger. She thought of Pater, perhaps in jail, perhaps on the run, and Alex, for whom troop movements were life, not symbols on a map. Richard Hammond had boarded a ship, and Bobby had watched him sail out of her life. He had only waved once, probably because of his bandages, so Bobby hadn't waved much either. She had merely stood on the dock and stared at him, tried to memorize him. Bobby was about to give up everything familiar and once again be alone. She had now worked her last day in the naval hospital and had a few days off until her ship arrived. One afternoon she was in her room sorting through her uniforms and a few possessions, trying to decide what was worth keeping and what she would need in the close quarters of a ship. She was holding up a rather seasoned white nurse's dress and wondering whether it could last her a while yet, when she heard a knock. She opened the door and saw the young receptionist who normally sat at the desk downstairs. "There's someone here who wants to see you," she said, and she smiled. "A Marine." "Who is it?" "He told me not to tell you his name. He said tell her to come down and see for herself. She won't believe it if you tell her. All I can say is he's kind of cute." Bobby was intrigued. She tried to think of the Marines she knew. Before she walked downstairs, she took a minute to run a comb through her hair, but she didn't put on any lipstick. She was wearing a civilian dress, a little linen sundress that needed to be thrown out with the rest of her worn-out things, but one she had thought would be comfortable on a workday like this. When she reached the main floor, she saw the Marine, but he was looking out the window, his back to her. She couldn't think who it was. He was a slim man, not one of those big-shouldered types she often saw in Marine uniforms. Then he turned around, and the air went out of her. It was David Stinson. "Hi," he said, and he grinned in that childlike way of his. "I'll bet you didn't expect to see me." "You're a Marine?" He nodded, still smiling, and then he walked to her. "I know you're engaged, but I'm still going to kiss you." He only gave her a little peck on the cheek, but Bobby was amazingly self-conscious about it. "I'm off to the war," David said. "I managed to stay out of it for a long time, but my patriotic zeal was finally too much for me. Besides, they were about to draft me." He leaned his head back and laughed. It was the same old David, but he looked so strained with his hair cut short. "But why the Marines?" "Oh, you know me. I always go for the best." He was still holding her hands. In some ways he was more appealing than ever, a little more filled out, and in spite of what he was saying, more subdued. "Let's walk outside," Bobby said. There were things she wanted to ask him, but not with the receptionist listening. "I hope you won't be ashamed to be seen with me. I look a fright." "Bobby, you're beautiful. I was just thinking how good the years have been to you. Is it all right if I tell you that?" "You can tell me anything you want, but you always did make things up." She took David out to the lawn, where they sat on the grass facing each other. David crossed his legs and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. Bobby, a little embarrassed by her bare legs and her freckles, tucked her legs under herself. "How did you know where to find me?" she asked him. "We got in last night. As soon as they let me off the ship this afternoon, I walked up to the hospital. They told me you were shipping out in a few days, but they also told me where the nurses' quarters were." He pulled a blade of grass from its roots, then stuck it in his mouth. Bobby watched him, remembered how his hands worked his shoulders, always with more motion than was needed, as though his body were bursting to do, to act, no matter how much he preferred to think. He wasn't as good-looking as Richard, but there was something electric about him. "So, tell me about this Richard guy you're going to marry," David said. Bobby felt herself blush. "He's a good man. I think you would like him," she said. "Will he give you room to think for yourself, Bobby? He's not one of those guys who will exercise his priesthood on you, is he?" Bobby smiled. "He never tries to boss me, if that's what you mean," she said. "But he's independent. I'm not going to get away with telling him what to do either." "Are you sure this is the right guy for you to marry?" "Yes, I'm sure this time," Bobby said, and she tried to keep her voice as light as David's. But then he said, "Bobby, I'm serious." Bobby tried to say the words with conviction, had them ready, but they didn't come out. Instead, she found herself saying, "I think everything will work out all right, David, but I have been a little worried lately. I don't know how to read Richard sometimes. He's going through a hard time, and he won't let me help him. Sometimes I wonder whether he'll ever be as open with me as I want him to be." "Don't compromise on that one, Bobby. There are too many married couples in this world who live in the same house, go about their business, and hardly seem to notice each other. When I'm with him, I don't worry as much. It's harder when we're separated like this." "You don't worry as much?" "Come on, David, you know me. I worry about everything." "Maybe so, but I don't want you to be unhappy. I didn't give you up for that." Bobby couldn't do this any longer. She didn't like the muddle of emotions she was feeling. What would Richard think if he heard this conversation? "You needn't worry about that," she said. "I'm sure everything will be fine." And then she changed the subject. They talked about Chicago and what David had been doing. 2 hours passed very quickly, and then David was saying that he had to get back to his ship. "Bobby, I don't know how long we're going to be here," he told her. "I don't even know whether I can get off the ship again. But could I see you again? I would at least like to see Honolulu, maybe eat dinner." That sounded like a date, and Bobby wasn't sure. But she did want to see him again. "Sure, we could take the bus into town." "All right. If I can get shore leave again, I'll call, all right?" "All right." Bobby was surprised by her own emotions, by the excitement she felt, but she didn't want to give him the wrong idea. "David, it's just, Sure, we're just old friends, don't worry. I won't bother you any more about Richard. I just like seeing you." I've missed you. Every day. Bobby took a long breath. David, don't. I'm sorry. I won't.